Hi, everyone. Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. In partnership with Common Frontiers, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast weekly at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, generally on Wednesdays. We're honored to have our guest join us today, Thursday. We broadcast on CODEPINK's YouTube channel. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Telegram, and at radindiemedia.com. Also, I want to take a minute to introduce you to our new and now sixth broadcast partner, the Interreligious Task Force on Central America, IRTF Cleveland, which brings together people from the Latin diaspora alongside various grassroots faith and secular communities to act in solidarity with oppressed peoples in southern Mexico, Central America, and Colombia through conscious raising and direct consumer and political advocacy to build long-term structural change. IRTF was formed as a response to the horrific violence of December 2nd, 1980, when two from Cleveland were murdered in El Salvador, Jean Donovan and Ursulane's sister Dorothy Cassell, alongside Marinol sisters from New York, Mara Clark, excuse me, I should know that, and Ida Ford. More info can be found at irtfcleveland.org. So we welcome them to our family of broadcast partners. So everyone, I'm really pleased for this conversation tonight. Our episode today is entitled Gustavo Petro at the United Nations, quote, "It is time for peace," his words in his general debate on Tuesday, September 20th in New York. In this episode, we will be in conversation with three Colombians living in the North America diaspora about their impressions of the Colombian president's address to the United Nations. Let me tell you who we'll be talking with this evening, and then I want to give you a brief background. So joining us from Toronto, Canada, Raul Burbano. He's Executive Director of Common Frontiers. Common Frontiers is also a WTF broadcast partner. Joining us from New York City, I think he is joining us. He's live on the subway on his way home, is Yhamir Chabur, who is with the Troika Collective. And if he is not with us at the moment, he will join us shortly. And then I want all of you to meet Samantha Wherry. She is the latest member, newest member, most recent member of our CODEPINK Latin America team. She's in Washington, D.C., and she's Colombian born as well. And so let me give you all a little background, and then we can open up our conversation. On Tuesday, September 20th, the first day of the United Nations General Assembly, Colombian President Gustavo Petro made his first address to the body. The speech sharply deviated from those of his conservative predecessors. Petro did not shy away from calling out global North countries for their role in the destruction of the environment and in perpetuation of the war on drugs as a symptom of their capitalist greed. He accused, quote, "You are only interested in my country to spray poisons on our jungle, to take our men to jail and put our women in exclusion. You are not interested in the education of the child, but in killing the jungle and extracting coal and oil from its entrails. The sponge that absorbs the poison, the rainforest, is useless. They prefer to throw more poisons into the atmosphere." So this was Petro's first trip to the United States since he was inaugurated on August 7. He was received on Sunday night, September 18th, by hundreds of supporters in Queens. Yhamir and Samantha were both there. On hundreds of people who showed their support to his administration's commitment to working for peace and ensuing the well-being of the Colombian people. So welcome all of you. I'm really honored to have this conversation with you. And I think just for the audience, I mentioned, Samantha was born in Colombia. So was Raul, raised in Canada. And then Yhamir, who will be joining us shortly, his parents fled Colombia, and Yhamir was born and raised in New York City. So we have a nice mix of North American, Colombian people and opinions. And I would like to ask each of you to start by giving the audience just a brief background of who you are, so they're familiar with your family's plight. And then maybe let's start with what part of your president's speech was most impressionable to you, or what part you feel needs further expansion. So Raul, let's start with you. I see you on the top of my screen. So
okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invite. This is exciting. Great to have a conversation about these important issues, especially around Colombian Gustavo's speech at the United Nations. I mean, I was born in Bogota, Colombia. Came to Toronto, Canada, and been living pretty much in Toronto, Canada for most of my life. My family, we left Colombia not for political reasons, more economic reasons, to get away from the violence and the economic situation and find a better life in the north, quote unquote. So yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of work around Colombia since, through my work at Common Frontiers, which is a collective of labor, ecumenical, and civil society organizations that work on issues related to the Americas. It was kind of Common Frontiers is like a large table of organizations in Canada that have been doing solidarity with Latin America, in the Americas in general. It started with the fight against the free trade agreement, sort of the tri-national, Canada, US, Mexico, building an understanding of the impact of the trade back in the 80s. We now know pretty clear what it is, and we knew back then what it was. So that's why we were kind of opposed to it. At least Common Frontiers was. It was before I was there anyway.
So this is, just for the audience, all of you should know it was Raul's election observation delegation to Colombia for the first round elections in May that I was supposed to join, was part of, and was not allowed to enter the country. And so it was Raul that was a big help in May to get me back home safely. But this is just really a significant achievement for the Colombian people to have Gustavo Petro as your new president. You had mentioned to me, I think in May, Raul, that this is the first time you and your mother living in Canada have been really motivated to actually participate in the electoral process and vote for Petro.
It was incredible. I've never voted in the Colombian elections, even though I have the right to from dual citizenship. So this was the first time in my lifetime that I registered to vote in the Colombian elections, and it was very exciting. It was really interesting to see the Colombian diaspora in Canada, at least where I was very close to, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, where it was really galvanized, mobilized quite a lot to protect the vote, to try to educate, Colombians and also, people in Canada around the issues and why it's so important to support a progressive government and the need for a change in Colombia. I mean, I don't think anybody can disagree that Colombia has been, a bastion of this, disappointments, supportive U.S. foreign policy in the region. And so it's very exciting that, there's finally going to be a break and a change. And I think this, the speech at the UN by, President Gustavo kind of carried that message along that was very consistent to his political campaigning.
And so what was it? Was there anything particular in his UN speech that really resonated with you? I mean, the speech as a whole was pretty profound. I have to say, I was in New York City that day, on Tuesday the 20th, and Lower Manhattan was just abuzz, particularly around the UN south of Lafayette Street. But people were just really excited about what he had to say. So what was the most profound part of the speech to you, or what made the biggest impression for you?
I think in general, the theme of how he challenged the capitalist development model, without saying capitalist development model, capital, powers that be as a whole, was really important for me, kind of as a general theme in terms of the destruction of the environment, how it prioritized the criminalization of drugs, the push to war, right? For me, that was, very, very important. It's clear that, that's the speech, the discussion, has basically challenged the prevailing understanding of how to fight the war on drugs, which the U.S. has led, the war, the international wars in general. I think I really like, it was pretty much at the end when he said, don't push us to take a side on the war, globally, referring to Ukraine. And I think that is very telling for, for people in the North who may not understand why many countries or many people in the global South, especially Latin America, would not be so interested and motivated to go and join the war effort, against Russia, not necessarily because they love Russia or not necessarily because they agree with Russia, but because our history has been a history of invasion, from the U.S. part, of proxy governments to destabilize. So it's hard to get behind, anything that's often pushed by the U.S. in terms of, supporting democracy and human rights. And for me, that kind of, at the end, that was very important because Gustavo has been very critical of, what he sees as dictatorial governments in Latin America, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela. So I was surprised, to be honest with you, that he wasn't as critical, for example, against Putin, right? Instead, he took a much more neutral stance and says, we must end the war. We need peace, which I thought was really interesting in terms of dealing with it. So, I thought that was excellent, and I found it quite inspiring.
Well, and regarding Venezuela, like within days of his inauguration, there was an exchange of ambassadors between Caracas and Bogota. And on the 26th September, the border between the two countries, which has been closed for 5 years, reopened with great fanfare. I mean, yeah. Immediate. It's like,
and he gave back the Venezuelan company, right? The fertilization,
yeah,
fertilizer, Monomoto, yeah. So I mean, he gave that back.
Yeah.
Right, which is incredible. So I mean, his I don't want to say his rhetoric, but his opinions of Venezuela and Maduro aren't very positive. But it's great that he understands, and at least he sees the importance of economic trade between the two countries and having progressive diplomatic relations, which is really refreshing and needed. Maybe I'll just mention one more thing that I thought was very important is sort of his call to build like an inter-American, inter-Latin America kind of process for peace to end the war on drugs. It's a very, it sits quite well within sort of the CELAC, the UNASUR kind of themes of, with what the Mexican president Almo was saying, where it's just like, basically, we as Latin Americans got to come together and find some solutions to these problems, working together irrespective of our political views, right? So I really like that. It kind of reminds me of that the Bolivarian dream of a larger Latin America working together to solve a lot of these issues, which is amazing, and it's important for the region, and we really need it. And hopefully, with the elections in Brazil, which most likely will be a positive outcome for Lula, it'll really going to change the dynamics in Latin America, and I think it'll give a lot of momentum and support for Gustavo's policies of creating more of like that inter-Latin American dialogue around the environment, the war on drugs, all these very critical issues, protecting and saving obviously the Amazon, that that is much needed in Latin America.
One of it was AMLO at the CELAC summit in Mexico City. So it was September 18th of last year, gosh, a year ago, where the focus really was on Latin America, Caribbean integration, regardless of domestic politics of each country, respecting the sovereignty of the domestic issues within each country, and forming some sort of regional solution, economically, health, social, all of it. Yeah. So yeah, it was it was nice to hear Petro reinforce that whole philosophy. And
I think it's amazing that it obviously resonated with many Colombians, in whether in Colombia or abroad, who supported the Gustavo during the electoral process. But it clearly resonated globally because I think it's the most watched UN speech on YouTube, anyways. So it's been watched quite a lot of times. So clearly, it's made an impact globally, not just to Colombians, which is great.
On the streets of New York, it was touted as the best UN general debate in the history of the United Nations. That's how strongly people were responding to it. It was really fantastic. So very exciting. So Samantha's joining us from Washington, D.C. And why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then let's talk about what you found to be the most significant parts of the president's address. I can say you're president. You voted, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me to your show, Terry. Yeah, so I was born originally on the outskirts of Medellin, which is the second biggest city. And then, but I grew up in Bogota, and then I moved to the States when I was 11 and went back to Colombia after I graduated from college to work with a US-based organization called Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective. So I was doing a lot of work of human rights, in the organization we call human rights accompaniment. So it was basically working alongside indigenous, Afro-Colombian and Campesino communities who were doing human rights work, but whose lives were at risk. And, you know, as many probably know, Colombia is one of the most dangerous country to be a human rights defender or an environmentalist. So that's particularly why that job is so needed in Colombia, because I have double citizenship and because I was working with a US-based NGO. The idea was to bring attention to the work that these social leaders were doing on the ground of trying to preserve the environment, trying to save the rivers, save the forest, as Petro.
All those things the president talked about.
Exactly. So it was the speech was, you know, it really hit home because, and it made me kind of homesick because I got so used to listening to Colombian environmentalists and human rights leaders give speeches like this all the time, like in a very poetic way, but also with a very clear analysis of power and understanding that the war on drugs, the war on the environment are not led by necessarily the Colombian government, but by the global north. So just hearing that speech was just kind of like brought me back to those moments and being in those rooms, in those spaces with these amazing leaders. PCN, which is one of the organizations that Francia came from, was one of the organizations that we used to work closely with, and you know, like just that was kind of an echo of these voices of these leaders, and yeah. So when I was doing that job in 2018. We brought an environmental leader from the Naja River, which is in the Pacific coast of Buenaventura, which is home to the biggest port in Colombia, but also one of the poorest regions in the country. And that's like the one port where most of the drugs leave Colombia to come to the US. And her speech, she was, when she came to do the speaking tour in the US, she was here to denounce the impacts of the war on drugs and the extractivism projects that were happening and tearing the social fabric in her community. So it was, during the tour, it felt like, okay, like we have all these small groups that we're speaking to, but who's actually listening, who's actually taking action? So actually hearing Petro basically regurgitate the same ideas and this big platform, and the most powerful country in the world, and like the cultural city of the world. It was just amazing. And at the UN in front of like the most powerful leaders in the world. So it kind of just, I don't know, it kind of gave like a little closure to that idea in my head that I had, like no one's actually listening. But when actually given the platform to speak on these issues, a big platform, a lot of people resonated with this message that Petro brought. As you guys already said, like that was one of the most listened speech. Everyone's, started writing articles, started analyzing it. But for me and for many Colombians, for many Colombian social leaders, for many Colombians who participated in the 2019 national strike, this is not really a new speech because we've heard it so many times before from indigenous communities, from Afro-Colombian communities and campesino communities who have been fighting and putting their lives on the line, literally, because they receive so many threats for the work that they do. That message being echoed was just really amazing.
It was uplifted in front of the entire world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was really, it was profound. For this episode, I entitled it Gustavo Petro at the UN, "It is time for peace," which was a quote in his address. And let's talk about peace for a minute, because peace for me, when I listen to his speech, peace has many forms and in many spaces, right? Environment, physical war, drugs, and capitalism, and the failure of capitalism, and how people in the global north use drugs to escape the failure of capitalism. That was like amazing. He said that. So let's talk about some of these various themes of peace that he was calling for, because he is really calling for peace in multiple directions, and without all of them, there is no complete peace for the earth and its people. And that's really what that was all very profound to me. Somebody in Yhamir, who we're hoping to join us, I saw him in New York, and I asked him what he thought. He said, it was almost like a Garcia Marquez speech, the magical, way of prose and speaking. And I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, peace in every form, as you said, peace with first stopping the extractivism, right? Peace with the earth, right? Protecting the earth, peace in terms of decriminalizing, or at least regulating, the war on drugs, and moving away from the criminalization, and especially how he clearly articulated how it impacts it impacts disproportionately, communities, Black communities in the north who are criminalized for this, to peace internationally, right? Peace, on a global stage. So, he weaved that theme of peace from an international to like a regional, and obviously local, in Colombia, where, that's been a big component. And he's doing it as a big tent, which is really important. And he's kind of taking out the ideological bent to it, and it's sort of like, let's come together, irrespective of who we are. And it's really interesting and important, because sometimes you want him to be a bit harder, like you want him to say like, rally against the U.S. a bit or something, and Chavez would say like, I smell sulfur, here. But he's much more, much more diplomatic, much more of a statesman, and the idea of peace and bringing people together under the big tent, seems to resonate, and it seems to, broaden his appeal to many people globally, which I think is important for what needs to be done in the region, right? Because there is, unfortunately, on a global scale, the push is for war. And it's so easily to, as a country, to get dragged into that. And I guess, Colombia obviously has a history of war internally. So we know the cost, the price of war. And clearly Gustavo has made it his mission to, bring peace to Colombia, but also, extend that to the environment and to globally, which is really incredible. It's amazing. And it's nice to see Colombia taking, a lead in that globally. Colombia has been known as, sort of, so many names I don't want to get into in terms of how it's been known in the region. destabilizing. But finally, we see Colombia kind of resonating in a very positive way internationally, trying to take leadership or proposing some really important ideas that that are critical for our time, and yet everybody talks about them, but there's very little action around them, which was great. Although, I mean, I must admit, I would have liked to have heard, and again, and maybe it's just me, and he does it so well, pointing fingers a little bit more, like the responsibility of the North in saving the planet, needs to be, in my opinion, I would have liked that to kind of be teased out a bit more, because I mean, if Colombia and Latin America are going to save the Amazon or the world, like where's the response? Are we in the North just to continue consuming, right? How is that going to be? We have to have the North with a level of responsibility to help save the planet as well.
Well, particularly in diminishing the drug market. In the United States and Europe are there's no comparative for 90% or more of the market, and there was something, and I'm hoping I can share a recording with all of you from one of our guests that was not able to make it tonight, and he does a lot of lobbying in Washington, D.C. And the comments on that Petro made about the use of drugs to escape unhappy lives, unhappy societies, basically failing capitalism, and people are anesthetizing themselves with the drugs. And to some people on the Hill in Washington, D.C., that was interpreted as Petro saying we need to legalize narcotics. And I know, like in countries such as Portugal, that was very successful because it took the profitability out of the trade and diminished the use, and then legalized what remained. And so that was one of the things. That was how some people on the Hill heard his comments about drug trafficking. I found that really, really fascinating, how it gets twisted, or how one culture hears it versus another. But it is Colombia that is, and other countries too, but because of the production and the exportation, it's the people and the culture and the fabric of society that's being destroyed by the industry. And I would argue that is one of the things that led to the revolution in Cuba, was to get prostitution, gambling, and drugs off the island and out of the country. And so maybe this is,
But it's interesting how you say how it could be interpreted very differently, the way they were interpreted in the Hill. Like, I think it was Samantha, the former president of Colombia, called Gustavo the great defender of cocaine, right? Like, it's just trying to like derail the whole thought process and not understanding really the essence of what he's talking about or getting to.
And the Republicans already, Petro's definitely ruffled some feathers. Rubio and Grassley from Iowa already sent a letter.
They must be going crazy.
Yeah, they're like, oh, like Petro is like ruining our war on drugs policy that has been so successful, and it is such a like disconnect from reality, and just kind of pushing the same narrative, pushing the same failed policies that have never worked either in the US or in Colombia. I'm actually pleasantly surprised that Biden's administration hasn't really made any like strong condemnations of the speech, considering that he was one of the like authors of Plan Colombia. So while he was making policies here to have harsh penalties for consumption in the form of imprisonment, he was also sending and pushing for military aid to stop the flow of these drugs to Colombia. So I mean, pleasantly surprised there, but I'm sure there will be something in the works that will come about later on, just like the news of the Venezuelan plane that was supposed to be inaugurated between Venezuela and Bogota, the first airline to fly, I think, since 3 years ago. And a call from Washington like already stopped that, so they're watching very closely. And
Really, it was
So
stopped?
it was the Confianza. It was the Confianza plane, the state-owned airline that was prohibited because the state airline, the Venezuela state airline Confianza is sanctioned. I mean, it's under OFAC regulation. But the private airline, the private Venezuelan airline was allowed to fly from Venezuela to Colombia. It was the state airline, which is sanctioned. And the criticism of the Petro administration is that they yielded, to the US Treasury and OFAC because Confianza is sanctioned, they didn't let the plane, cross the border and come in to Bogota. So the criticism is they yielded to the US State Department and didn't fully open.
Interesting.
Yeah. So,
yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of yielding to US foreign policy pretty soon.
Well, you have to, I mean, I can only, talk from the outside looking in, but, this is a huge change, like Honduras government. And after so many years of US control through business and international loans and military, this isn't, change is not just going to happen. This was not like a revolutionary change where everybody who didn't agree with the government was thrown out of the country. This was an electoral change, a constitutional change. There's a lot, and Raul, you and I have had this conversation after the first round elections, or I think after the inauguration, where, there's a lot to dismantle before the country can move forward. There's a lot of deconstruction that has to be done. And I think that we don't talk about that enough. And then building peace, and building peace is going to mean the president has to talk to everyone, even people that he doesn't like, that his party doesn't like, that people who voted for him don't like. But unless everyone feels they have a voice or have been heard, how do you build a unified, lasting peace? And without that peace, you cannot start building a new country.
Absolutely.
Samantha,
Yeah,
you want to go ahead.
Yeah, and I think Petro has and his cabinet, he has really, really strong leaders who come from the grassroots movement, which is really awesome to see, and organization leaders who have been on the field, who have been in really remote and rural parts of Colombia in which the state has never had presence. So, with Petro's project of total peace, of trying to make amends and try to bring all these different armed groups to the table, I think, it's a really, really big step forward for Colombia. Considering that the Duque administration was trying to do everything in its power to completely destroy the peace process that had already been signed with the previous administration, with the Santos administration. So, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of peace and also, I think, a lot of communities would say like peace is not just the absence of conflict, but also like the presence of social justice. And so I think he's going to have a really big task of getting to these rural communities that are completely lacking any government institutions that, you know, have to literally take their sick on their back to the hospitals because the roads like are non-existent. There's no ambulances that go all the way to these parts of the country. So I think he does have a plan for that. But obviously 4 years is not enough, you know, 4 years is not enough to do all of that building, and plus kind of reconcile all of these different groups in the country that are not necessarily in agreement with how he's running things, you know.
You know, this is just a personal observation or a personal anecdote. You mentioned, you know, the infrastructure. People have to carry, you know, injured, sick people on their backs, walk to a hospital. Could be days, and the no paved roads. And this reminds me of a conversation last year when I was in Colombia during the Paro Nacional with the delegation out of Argentina. After the delegation was over, we were all kind of debriefing, and there were 21 in that delegation, 20 Argentinians and me. And they asked me, you know, well, you've been here now for 10 days all over the country observing all these human rights violations and, you know, seeing the realities on the ground. How do you feel about you as a US citizen, your US tax dollars being spent in this country? What do you see as a, you know, what has your money bought? You know, my response was quite honestly, misery. There's no public education that's worth mentioning, no hospitals, no roads, nothing. Military bases, the US tax dollars bought military bases, but nothing for the people. Nothing for the, you know, just day-to-day people. And it was a profound question, and it was almost embarrassing, you know, to be asked it. But you know, it was, they really, you know, they really made their point. And yeah, so hopefully a new relationship, the relationship with the United States it's not possible for that to change overnight. I don't believe. I mean, and Samantha, you've already you know, commented on Senator Rubio and Grassley. What else is happening on the Hill, Samantha? Anything more that you've heard? And also, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, in terms of Colombia, I haven't. That's one of the main things that I've heard. Obviously, the what's her Maria Salazar, the representative, also just, you know, kind of losing it and making all these lives on her social media about like how Duque is gonna turn Colombia into Venezuela, a socialist country, and like, you know, just like red baiting. And you know, this is very, very typical of these like really far right wing people who are in constant connection and contact with the elite and the like really racist and wealthy Colombians who travel back and forth between Colombia and Miami, have their beach house in Miami and like also their country house in Colombia, which is, you know, like those are definitely the ones that are out in the streets. I don't know if you guys saw on Monday, there was some like anti Petro protest throughout Colombia, and they call themselves like La Gente de Bien, and somebody went out into the streets to interview them and be like, what are you for? Like, why are you out here? And all they had to say was just all these racist and awful things about Francia, about, you know, red baiting, talking points, and like pretty much any bits and pieces that they hear from the right wing media and the senators and in Colombia. So
it's the same. It's that same right wing rhetoric. I mean, it's like a, you know, a template, right? For every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, they're all the same. They're all the same.
And unfortunately, it works though. But you know, the unfortunate part is, you know, that misinformation, the baiting, the racist, all that tends to work in terms of, the majority of people tend to believe that stuff when if you're going, I mean, we saw the referendum in Chile failed, right? The first peace process in Colombia, not the peace process, but, voting for the peace agreement, the first one in Colombia, they failed, right? So then we have to go to a second vote. Like, it's interesting how that misinformation line, and it's mainly fear. Like my experience is you inject fear. They're going to make you a Venezuela. They're going to take your house. They're going to expropriate your land. Colombia now is going to become the big protector of cocaine, right? Like it's that whole fear that people are like, oh my God, unfortunately, it sounds ridiculous maybe to us in the North who are kind of watching it from the outside, but when you live in the country and you're bombarded by so much of that, and you've been fed a diet, for many decades of misinformation on this, people really pick it up and get really scared. And then, if there's going to be any kind of referendum or anything, I think it's going to be challenging, for the government, for sure.
Change is scary, even if you're talking about changing your local PTA, or change is scary for people in general. And I don't say that as a criticism. It's just change is hard for all of us. So listen, everyone, I wanna be sure that our next guest, Yhamir, Chabur, has a chance to share with all of you. I'm so happy, Yhamir, that you've been able to join us. Yhamir is talking to us from Queens, New York. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
There you go. So here you are. So Yhamir is with the Troika Collective, a journalist, and he also works with tenant organizing in the Bronx. And I asked him to join us this evening because he is US born to parents from Colombia, and he is really politically active. And so Yhamir, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and then share with us what the most impressionable part of Petro's speech was to you, or what part you feel needs a little bit more expanding upon.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Terry, for having me. I'm so glad to be here. I apologize for being late. Coming from New York with all this traffic, and anything can always happen here in the Big Apple, in la Gran Manzana, like we always say, But I'm glad to be here in Queens, in one of the biggest diasporic communities in the United States. Also, in one of the many cities in the diaspora where Petro won, New York City, very working class Colombians in the neighborhood of Jackson Heights. But yes, I'm of Colombian parents. Just to share with the audience, I'm also the son of ex-M19 guerrilla, my father, and my uncle were also part of M19, which were the guerrilla insurgency that Gustavo Petro was a part of. So this victory is very big for my father's side of the family. And it was just beautiful that I was able to participate in the August 7th inauguration in the capital of Bogota. And the same energy, the same speech that I felt from Gustavo Petro is the same, it kind of augmented itself in the United Nations. I think a lot of people on the left were blown away, like they've had high expectations, and how Gustavo Petro did a very good job of connecting the war on drugs to the climate crisis, to the war of resources, imperialistic wars of resources worldwide. Like, he didn't shy away from saying certain rhetoric. And I think he blew a lot of people on the left within the United States that criticized him because he had rhetoric kind of alluding that Venezuela was a dictatorship or Nicaragua was a dictatorship. But he kind of flipped those expectations, because as soon as he's gotten into power, what has he done? He's opened up relations with Venezuela. He abstained, Colombia abstained in the OAS vote condemning Nicaragua, and also these peace talks now that have been reactivated in Cuba with the ELN. I mean, yeah, he's blown people's expectations, even my own. And also the fact that, like, his speech, it kind of was very poetic. Like, if you understand the Spanish language and all this other stuff, he kind of reminded me of, like, the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is one of his main influences. how he spoke very like beautifully about Colombia, how it's a very magical place. Like he spoke about like the butterflies I have right over here. That I like this button I got from his inauguration. These are the butterflies that Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote in many of his beautiful books. But yes, I think he did a very good job of really like explaining about the problems with capitalism, the problems with imperialism. I just love how he spoke about like how the war on drugs has caused like genocide. Like he brought that to the forefront, how it caused a genocide in his continent, and also just he kept saying usted, like ustedes, like the ustedes, like them were like basically the people of the North, like the United States and Europe, and he didn't have to say he didn't have to talk about who was the elephant in the room. Like the United States knew that he was directing a lot of this stuff towards him. Like I loved when he said that the war on drugs has failed. La guerra contra las drogas ha fracasado. Like that was so beautifully, like that kind of really took me back when Hugo Chavez like had that sulfur comment against George Bush. But yeah, no, it was just I was very proud. I was like, wow, this is a beautiful representation we have as Colombian people, and how Gustavo Petro is now showing like our greatness as a people. Like, because usually we get this bad narrative of like us being drug dealers because of Pablo Escobar, or us being like a right-wing hub for the United States imperialists. But now Petro's showing like our multiculturalism. And also like, I will also say like, and I need to mention this, because I love always mentioning this man, of Simón Bolívar. I love how, Petro's speech was very, very Bolivarian, and he spoke about like Latin Americans coming together and unifying in order to solve this problem of the war on drugs. But anyways, I know there's more for us to talk about, but yes. And also just like, I also talking to like Colombians here in New York City, talking to people who have been in the forefront of the campaign of Colombia Humana, they felt that his speech like really, really like made the Uribismo, the right-wing ideology of the ex-president Álvaro Uribe, is collapsing slowly on itself. And the right wing thought that Petro wouldn't do anything in the United Nations, and he blew off expectations against the right wing. And you can even say that he kind of is helping out Lula right now in Brazil, with these Sunday's elections, because he blew out Bolsonaro out of the water as well. So, with the whole climate crisis because of the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's all I have to say right now.
So there's a couple things I want to ask you. Well, first of all, just going back to a comment you made, Samantha, the former president of Colombia, Duque, has a job with a Washington, D.C. think tank. So, you can just see how, everybody washes each other's hands. And so he doesn't have the presidency in Colombia representing the United States. He now has a Washington, D.C. think tank job. For Samantha and you, Yhamir, you were both in Queens on Sunday, September 18th, at the rally with Gustavo Petro. Can you just briefly share with the audience what that was like? And then Yhamir, in closing, I wonder if you will share with us since you mentioned Simón Bolívar, you were at Plaza Bolívar in Bogota for the inauguration on 7 August. What it meant, what it was like to see Simón Bolívar's sword return to the plaza. But let's talk about September 18th real quick, since you were both there.
Sure. So I went from DC directly to the event. So I had like my backpack and I had like my overnight stuff with me. But people were there waiting for hours and, just chanting Petro, Francia, and like si se pudo, like we did it. And just, it was amazing because I've never been in the US and a space like that to receive, you know, like a president or like someone that I really admire, with a bunch of other Colombians who are also living in the US. So it was really, really beautiful. And people were, you know, when he came out, he did come out a little bit later than I think was anticipated, but like people right away, like all their energy was up again, like everyone was shouting his name. His speech was beautiful. Just, you know, he's just a really, really great speaker. He, like the thought, the weight in every one of his words is just really something that he definitely contemplates and really thinks through before giving these speeches. And, you know, I think in that speech, he was connecting to the migration story and kind of the struggles that people have to go through when they have to leave their country. And so, you know, he was in a way sending a message that we want to make Colombia a country where you can return and come back again, you know, that you don't have to flee from. And that's especially relevant now because there's a huge amount of Colombians, I think, are like the top like fifth or sixth nationality that are coming up through the border. So, you know, the conditions in Colombia are not the greatest. They were even worse before Petro came into power. But he made that promise that we will make Colombia a place for you to return, a place where you don't have to flee from. So yeah, it was really great to be there. And also, like, there was so many artists that came and played folkloric music and dance. And yeah, it kind of made me a little homesick, but it was great.
How about you, Yhamir? Briefly on the September 18th, and then we want to hear how you felt when you saw the sword return to the plaza.
I got you. So just to explain my experience that day, let me just show you this badge right here. I was volunteering for the consulate. I had that, you know, I felt the whole experience from 8 hours being in front of the courthouses, and it was very how can I say? It was a very long day setting stuff up, working with the folks from the consulate that, you know, to also give context. The folks in the consulate are in a process of changing because they're still right wing, but they still had to obey orders from the president. So I had to know how to maneuver through that. It was very, very, very interesting. But I remember when the crowd started coming out. Yeah, they were yelling out, you know, for Petro, but then they started booing the people of the consulate because the consulate in New York City is just horrible. I mean, right now it's gonna go through some changes, but I'm just saying, as a Colombian from New York City, I've had a horrible experience with that consulate of trying to get my dual citizenship, and I hope under Gustavo Petro, I'm gonna get that dual citizenship. But anyways, they started yelling out, like, you know, afuera, or, you know, out with all these Uribistas, or they even thought I was with them, you know, because I was volunteering, and I had to show my my badge right here, you know what I mean, like to show that I'm on their side. but it was
I'm a butterfly.
I'm a butterfly.
I'm a mariposa, not an Uribista.
I'm a socialist Bolivarian butterfly. Yeah, no, like we were waiting the whole day for Petro. I mean, he came even after when the event was supposed to be over. It was from 5 to 8. He arrived at 8 o'clock, and he gave a very powerful speech acknowledging the diaspora, the migrants. You know, he spoke about the importance of the migrants towards the Colombian economy as far as sending remittances back home, money remittances. It kind of reminded me of a little bit of Rafael Correa with the Ecuadorian community here in New York City, which is big as well, about how he really focused on the importance of the migrants. He spoke about that. He spoke about, it was kind of like a kind of excerpt of what he was going to say in the UN about the war on drugs. And then he closed out and like met everybody's expectation when he announced that he would have the first indigenous foreign minister from Santa Marta, from La Sierra Nevada, be part of the consulate in New York City, the first indigenous foreign minister in the consulate in New York City. So it was a very powerful speech that Gustavo Petro gave. And then after, you know, he went out of his way with guards, you know, he had guards all around him, but he went out of his way to say hi to people, shake people's hands. And I had the opportunity, you know, to see Gustavo, like Petro come close to me because I was carrying my M19 flag, which I bought in the inauguration, La Plaza de Bolivar, you know. So, and I was around X-19 ex-combatants here in New York City. So it was just a very powerful night. It felt like, you know, like a new awakening, a new, you know, this new awakening once again in Latin America. But also to describe, and also just also personally, that was also a powerful moment for me because in front of the courthouse is where my parents also got married, like when I was little too. Oh. So it kind of took me back to, it kind of went full circle for me. But sure. Yes, as a Queens Colombian. But so going to the inauguration, yes, it was very powerful just to be part of that inauguration and to see like it was just packed. I felt like all parts of Colombia came from all over to go see that historic inauguration of Gustavo Petro and of Francia Marquez. And I was very happy that I was able to participate in that inauguration with my father, who was an ex-combatant of the M19 movement, who went to prison and was in prison with the comandante of theirs, Carlos Pizarro. So it was very moving. And just, I remember being there and like being on top of like the Palace of Justice, La Palacio de Justicia, which is right in front of La Palacio, it's right across La Palacio de Nariño, which historically, that palace was assaulted by Gustavo Petro's M19 movement like decades ago. And I was with the youth of M19 as well, you know, shouting out, you know, Duque Chao, Duque Chao, Chao, Chao. I've never seen a person like been like getting kicked out the way he was getting kicked out. But I remember when I was, when Petro, and also like before I get into like when Petro brought out the sword of Bolivar, because there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, when he was given the presidential slash, like the person who put the presidential slash on him was a very big thing because he kind of broke protocols from like regular protocols of presidential inaugurations where it's supposed to be somebody in parliament to put on the slash. He allowed the daughter of his commander, of his comandante, Carlos Pizarro, that she's a senator named Maria Jose de Pizarro, to put the presidential slash on him. Like my father was in tears. Like everybody in M19 was in tears when they saw something like that, because it's like, you know, you saw the legacy of Pizarro alive in the plaza. So, and just though when he put on the slash, and his first order as president was that to fetch the sword of Bolivar, that this is a popular order. This is an order from the popular masses. And the soldiers didn't know what to do, because at that moment, like they were told by Duque that the sword wasn't coming to the inauguration. This was the last attempt for Duque to try to one up Petro, but Petro said that the sword was coming to the inauguration. And I make this joke because I was there, but I didn't know what was going on, because it was a 10-minute recess to bring the sword to the inauguration. And I was just like, when I heard about what happened and when I was seeing the sword coming and people yelling out, alerta, alerta, alerta que camina, espada de Bolívar por América Latina, I was like blown away. And I realized at that moment, I was like, yo, I can imagine Venezuelan Twitter blowing up. Like all those things, all that resentment that they had against Petro, because Petro said, oh, Venezuela's a dictatorship. Oh, Maduro might be this. It all went out the window and they started hashtagging Bolivar Vive. Even Maduro got over it too, because he made a video demonstrating how he was watching the sword being brought to the Plaza of Bolivar. So, and there was an impressive speech that Petro gave on the sword. Like he referenced the sword various times in his speech, talking about how the sword is very important to our culture, to our people. And it's like also when the sword was being brought, I found it funny too that all the heads of states got up, but the only one that didn't get up was the King of Spain that sat down.
And for our audience, just so the audience understands, it was that sword that liberated what is today Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Panama, Bolivia from the Spanish Empire.
To add on to that, sorry, just really quickly, this is important too, because that same sword was a sword that was robbed by Gustavo Petro's M19 movement. It was a way of M19 to kind of expropriate the sword and for the people. They were saying they were taking back the sword for the people, and that sword went all over Latin America and went to Panama and went to Cuba. It went all over Central America. Then it came back to Colombia in the 90s after they signed the peace deal with the Colombian oligarchy. And this is kind of like 3 months before and I didn't even mention this either, when the comandante, the commander, Carlos Pizarro, was assassinated while he was running for the presidency of Colombia. So that's what also brought full circle when you also think about that history that it has when Gustavo Petro's M19 movement. But anyways, he spoke about, like how that sword was important and how it symbolized like our people's liberation, and also talking like this sense of integration, like unification of the continent. And I felt like at that moment, we spoke about this, Terry, that it's kind of like Bolivar once more came back, was resurrected. And, it wasn't just the death of Uribismo, but also of Santanderismo as well.
Yes. Yeah. Santanderismo. Yeah. The oligarchy that's run Bogota, Colombia for 200 years. I know Simon Bolivar has returned. They are done, or being phased out, maybe is the. So listen, all of you, we've been talking for an hour. I don't want to end this conversation. It's so beautiful to hear all of you share your words and your feelings and your interpretations. Is there anything, maybe Raul, you want to make a closing statement?
Yeah, I guess maybe just to follow on what we were just talking about. It seems like, it's been 20 years or so since the Bolivarian Revolution, and we're kind of seeing a little bit of that sort of come back kind of full circle where, Latin American integration is clearly going to become a much more important concept in the Americas, with hopefully with the Lula's election in Brazil, as I mentioned, with what Almo's doing in Mexico City in terms of reviving and bringing back CELAC and UNASUR. So I think we're in for really exciting times in Latin America in terms of changes, whatever pink tide, whatever socialists, social democrats. But I do think what that's going to bring is it's going to bring, like it did, 20 some odd years ago, is sort of the U.S. again, foreign policy becoming much tougher on Colombia. Obviously, Colombia is going to become, a sore thumb, in a sore kind of component for the United States. And we'll see a lot more of that, just the way, as was mentioned on this meeting, that the Conviasa plane could not land in Colombia. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that legalistic kind of tying Gustavo's hands behind his back in terms of free trade agreements. If we're going to stop extractivism, you're going to have to look quite closely into those free trade agreements to see what you can and can't do unilaterally anyways. So it's going to be interesting times in Latin America. Lots of positive going on, but I do think we're going to start seeing much more U.S. Involvement and intervention in the region, like we did 20 some odd years ago with the Bolivarian Revolution.
So thank you, everyone. Really, what a fantastic conversation. And I'm so thankful all of you were available to join this episode. I want to remind the audience that you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. We broadcast generally every Wednesday evening, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. We're thankful to have our guest join us tonight, Thursday at 7:30 p.m. You can watch us on CODEPINK YouTube Live. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Telegram, and also at radindiemedia.com. Also, be sure to catch CODEPINK Radio, which broadcasts every Thursday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern on WBAI out of New York City, WPFW out of Washington, D.C. And that program can also be found on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So be sure to join us next week, everyone. And again, thank you to our four guests, Raul Burbano, Samantha, Wherry, and Yhamir Chabur. I hope to have you all back as the Petro administration unfolds in Colombia and watch all these possibilities hopefully become reality for you and your country. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.